Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on what ISEB is now offering for pupils in year 7 and 8, including the new CE specifications and the IPQ. Having not been able to attend any conferences this year, we weren't able to hold our own conference. It is a real pleasure to be engaging with several hundred teachers who signed up for these sessions. We hope that you find this introductory session helpful, and we look forward to seeing you at other events in the coming months. Please tell us what you think of this session so we can build your feedback in as we plan other events for further professional development. For me personally, it's really exciting to see the launch of these specifications. When I became ISEB chair in October 2018, I committed to a full consultation on the future of CE, and I was delighted by the number of teachers from senior and prep schools who wanted to contribute. In what seems now like the far-off pre-pandemic days, it would have been unheard of for such a consultation process to take place without meeting face-to-face. And so we held a series of meetings to discuss CE as a whole and individual subjects. And two key elements underpinned discussions. First, we wanted to address the view that CE was in some way outmoded and focused too much on imparting a huge body of knowledge. Second, we wanted to address the perception that it lent itself to rote teaching. This drew us into focusing squarely on what CE is for. So while retaining a function as an entrance examination, its value lies in providing an opportunity for prep schools to acknowledge what pupils have achieved in year 7 and 8, and allowing senior schools to know what pupils arriving at the beginning of year 9 know and understand and can do. And as such, it can provide the backdrop for exciting teaching and fulfilling learning. To ensure this, we began to focus on what we initially called learner profiles. What sort of learners would pupils who had followed the CE specifications actually be? We were perhaps a bit idealistic about this, and at times rather wordy, but a clear consensus emerged, and this showed us what so many teachers see as the value of CE. Over time, these have been refined and condensed, but those of you who were involved in the consultation will recognize the things that we talked about, especially the shorthand of less is more, less focus on what pupils know and more on what they can do with what they know. It's not about knowledge versus skills, but how acquiring knowledge enables the development of skills. And so now we have on the front of all of the specifications a clear indication of what CE is all about. First of all, CE equips pupils not only for the next stage of their education, but for lifelong learning. Many of you will have heard me say before that Key Stage 3 in general and years 7 and 8 in particular are the last bastion of independence in the curriculum between the tyranny of Key Stage 2 tests and often 3-year courses leading to GCSEs. Whatever is going to happen to GCSEs in the coming years, CE will assist in developing pupils who enjoy reading and are able to articulate clearly, orally, and in writing. And then CE is based on a secure foundation of subject knowledge, concepts, and skills. So while we believe in the importance of examinations, of assessment, of subjects, and of knowledge, we want these to underpin understanding of wide-ranging concepts and skills. This helps pupils understand how subjects connect with each other and to demonstrate cultural awareness and empathy, developing an understanding of their own place in the world. Thirdly, CE encourages pupils to apply what they know to new situations. Applying knowledge and developing skills are essential to growing in confidence and flexibility as learners. Our consultation wanted to make explicit the expectation that pupils should have the confidence to weigh up evidence and make up their own minds, and the resilience to learn from their mistakes. And finally, CE develops enthusiastic learners who are open to new ideas and experiences, who are curious, questioning, and keen to experiment. The teachers we spoke to were proud subject specialists whose motivation was to nurture enthusiasm and open-mindedness. Our specifications should encourage pupils to have the skills to work independently and collaboratively. So in this way, CE is about more than the assessment at the end. In getting to the point where a pupil can perform at their best in these examinations, they will develop as learners, and thus will CE acknowledge what they have achieved and what they know, understand, and can do. But we felt something was missing, something which would allow pupils to apply all this to an area of knowledge not defined by any specification, but generated by their own interests. This is what motivated us to develop an age-appropriate version of the extended project qualification, which we have come to call the ISEB project qualification, or IPQ. We see this as a real opportunity for exciting learning through real research. The IPQ can be undertaken in subject timetabled or homework time, or in timetable time, like after examinations in the summer term of year 7, or after CE itself, or of course as a co-curricular activity. It allows pupils to ask a question that interests them, to research the answer, to amend the question in the light of the research, to reach conclusions and to present those in whatever form they wish, be it an essay, an artifact, a podcast, a PowerPoint presentation, a performance, or whatever. Crucially, it's the entire process which is assessed, and the output is only one part of that. So we think that CE plus IPQ make for an exciting and fulfilling learning experience for pupils and allow for exciting and fulfilling teaching. I think that's probably quite enough about the origins and the thought processes behind it all, the why, the whence, and the wherefore. But it's with great pleasure that I hand over now to our new CEO, Julia Martin, to say more about the how the specifications will bring all of this to life. Julia, thank you.
Thank you, Durrell. Well, as Britain's oldest school exam, dating back to 1904, the Common Entrance has been an established rite of passage for generations. Both Durrell and I remember ours very well, and my own children are experiencing that heady balance of nerves, but that later feeling of achievement that's mixed with the anticipation about the next stage of their education and their lives. Transition's a really important milestone for young learners, and recognising this, our aim is to balance heritage with innovation. And the new specifications have been developed to retain the underpinning knowledge that CE is renowned for, alongside the development of key academic skills. These new specifications aim to encourage teaching and learning that makes the examination of a natural culmination of 2 years of study. And it develops learners that can apply what they know and can do to unfamiliar questions in the assessment, with a sense of confidence in their ability and ending one stage of their education thoroughly equipped for the next. Of course, CE is best expressed by our subject experts. So I'm going to hand you over this evening to Dr. Neil Ingram. He's formerly Head of Science at Clifton College and now in the Education Department at the University of Bristol, training science teachers. He writes books and he's chair of our esteemed science panel. So thank you so much, Neil. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Julia. And thank you everyone for coming along this afternoon to our webinar about the science specification for 13 plus. We all hope you have an interesting and informative time with us. As you've heard, the revision of the science specification is part of a wider revision of all the syllabuses within the ISEB family. And they are designed to help young people prepare for the challenges of the next decade. And if we think about that in terms of science and things, that's a major, major thing. Climate change, inventions of new vaccines, all of these are at the cutting edge of scientific thought. So to use Durrell's phrase, what does less is more mean for science? Well, Common Entrance Science, as you've heard, has always been and will continue to be a strong, knowledge-rich curriculum. But the revision is designed to offer improved opportunities to allow pupils to develop a wider range of skills and attributes for the modern world. Have the next slide, please. And the next slide, please. Thank you. What we want to do is to inspire pupils who are confident, open, with a secure foundation in science, who can think critically, who are curious with a love for learning. And as you've heard, this generation will be lifelong learners, able to think independently about a whole range of critical issues. Have the next slide, please. A couple of weeks ago, at the end of April 2021, Ofsted produced a very important document which reviewed the nature of science curricula in schools in England for both maintained and independent sectors. As you're probably aware, Ofsted is putting much more emphasis on the development of science curricula at the level of schools rather than examination boards. And this slide, which you don't have to read now, shows part of this report, and it's a quote from the report. And what it's saying is that a successful science curriculum has two parts to it. It has the scientific knowledge, but it also has what it's called disciplinary knowledge, which is how scientific knowledge grows, how it's produced, and how it develops. I was quite gratified to read that, because this is exactly the approach that we took a couple of years ago when we started to revise the science specification at 13 plus. And so the rest of the presentation is really going to be looking at scientific knowledge and disciplinary knowledge to see how it works out in the new spec. In our spec, what Ofsted called disciplinary knowledge, how science grows and develops, we've called thinking and working as a scientist, with the rather catchy acronym of TWAS. And TWAS is really to do with scientific skills, analysis and development. Have the next slide, please. As you've heard, the whole curriculum initiative arose from consultation with key stakeholders in both senior schools and preparatory schools. And it's a very forward-looking initiative with what I think are exciting possibilities for both prep schools and for senior schools. The key take-home message of today's webinar is that this is not merely a revision of the previous specification. This is something which is new. It's a new conception in many ways, and therefore we urge prep school heads of science to have conversations with their colleagues in science department and in the wider school to think about the best way to implement these proposals. One possible and maybe jaundiced view of the prep school science curriculum is that it was merely a vehicle for preparing pupils for common entrance exams and entry to senior schools. I've never quite believed that, but it's often said that. But now it's got a much bigger function. It's more than a preparation tool. In many ways, the course is now bigger than the examination. And what we're hoping to do is to invite preparatory schools to develop a science curriculum that reflects them, their school, their values, their expertise, their interests. and allows the pupils to develop their own expertise and interests too. And this is something that prep schools have been asking for some time. The course, as I say, is bigger than the examinations. Can I have the next slide, please? So, as my father would say, how are we going to do all this without squeezing a quart into a pint pot? Well, the first step we took was to intentionally reduce the size of the core content of knowledge. You need to look at this very carefully. We have eliminated some topics completely, but most topics have been thinned out and content has been lost for most topics. We've thick and thin sliced the salami, as it were. And almost every part of the content has been affected. And so we're reluctant to produce a one-page summary of this, because what we really want you to do is work through it in detail to track the changes for yourselves. Because this is the process that's integral to developing the kinds of schemes of work that we think you will want to use in the future. We have worked on the assumption that each part of the specification, each row of the specification content grid, should be taught in around about 2 hours of contact time plus homework. That's the minimum we think it will take. And we've notionally timed the whole course using that model, and we find that it leaves significant times for you to develop other things within that context. So, for example, there might be a practical activity that you particularly want to use in a particular topic, and that will extend the time you spend on that topic beyond the notional 2 hours plus homework. Other areas of the syllabus specification you may want to leave as is. The key thing is that whatever you do with the specification, when you're not teaching the content, should allow the students to develop their TWAS skills and wider skills. And it's up to you, the schools, to decide how they want to allocate the time on their course. But we would urge all schools, and this is very important, not to reduce the total amount of time used to teach science simply because the content looks thinner. If you do that, you won't give yourself enough time to develop the skills and competencies that we think are an integral part of this specification. We have always had a problem in Common Entrance Science in trying to specify practical work to be done. We know that schools vary enormously in their ability to do practical work. Some schools have full-time technicians, others don't have technicians at all. Some have bespoke laboratories, others don't. Some have fume cupboards, many don't, and so on. And therefore, what we've always tended to do is specify 1 or 2 key practicals that we think everyone should be able to do. And we call those practicals recommended practicals. And we want to be able to assess those recommended practicals. We had a debate as to whether to call them core practicals like they do at GCSE and A level, and we decided not to, because we didn't want to give the impression that the core practicals were the only practicals you had to do. So we chose an alternative name, which is recommended, but with the caveat that we are able to assess those pretty directly in the exam if we want to. One of them, for example, is we want students to be able to make a microscope slide. But we know that it is possible to learn to make a microscope slide by watching a video without necessarily doing it yourself. We prefer it if students had first-hand experience of this, but we recognise that if that's not possible, then a video would be the next best thing. So we want schools to develop practical work and schedules that gives pupils a practice to develop all of the skills associated with thinking and working as a scientist. And this is a very, very powerful preparation for their future senior school science careers. We'll continue to assess the course in a very similar way to as present. This revision is really about the pedagogy of teaching science rather than making large-scale changes to the examination. We will continue, therefore, to assess knowledge, understanding and practical skills within strong contexts, which provide contextual clues to help the students to remember things in the exam. We'll also be building upon the knowledge from 11+, which was also a key recommendation of the recent Ofsted report. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Therefore, we would urge you to read carefully the whole of the specification and not just the content pages, because it is in the whole of the specification where the vision for the course is outlined. Have the next slide, please. Thank you. So in the next part of the presentation, what we'll do is pick out a few of the key features from the specification which are new and should form part of any development planning that you do on the new course. And it really is important that you share and discuss with your colleagues how you want these changes to be implemented. We have a hierarchy of verbs that explain the depth and knowledge and understanding required from the content. And these are understand, know, and recognize, or in order, know, understand, and recognize. Can I have that next slide, please? Know statements describe facts that need to be remembered. And we can ask questions directly in the exam on know facts, as it were, without putting any context in. These are the kind of questions that might be asked in some of the multiple choice questions at the beginning of the paper. We are in the process of preparing the first set of exams for this particular course. Even though you haven't started teaching it, we are well on the way to producing the first papers. And one of the things that all of our team leaders are doing is making sure that direct knowledge without context is only assessed using know statements. And that's something that we will continue to do. So, for example, know the word equation for photosynthesis. It's a statement of fact. It needs to be remembered and it can be asked directly. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Lovely. Thank you very much. Understand statements develop out of knowledge. They require a greater depth of conceptualization, and they're usually put into a wider scientific framework, such as a model. So, for example, understand the importance of carbon dioxide, water, and light in the production of new biomass. This takes the basic word equation for photosynthesis, but requires candidates to understand the scientific importance of that equation. And usually, in fact, invariably, I would say, understand questions require either short answers or extended writing, and they're normally assessed within specific contexts within questions. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Excuse me, recognize statements. Take scientific knowledge and understanding and apply it to society or to a practical understanding of science. For example, recognize that a variety of processes are used to generate electricity. We do not require candidates to have an in-depth knowledge of nuclear power or hydroelectricity, but we would expect candidates to be able to discuss, if we provided them with appropriate stimulus material, which type of electricity generation is the cleanest or the most economic. These are recognized questions. And every paper will have some questions which require candidates to evaluate information provided in the question using their own scientific knowledge and understanding in order to reach a conclusion. And those are the kind of open-ended questions we get towards the end of the papers. And they're invariably drawn upon recognized kind of statements. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. All of our papers are written to quite tightly designed specifications using 3 assessment objectives, which we call AO1, AO2, and AO3. AO1 is know and understand. AO2 is applying and analysing. And AO3 is evaluating and creating. And we provide a minimum mark allocation, which we publish in the specification for each of these assessment objectives in each of the papers. Go to the next slide, please. Now, this is something that I've wanted to do for a while now. For the first time in the science specification this time, we've actually defined a series of command words that we use in our papers. The definitions of these command words we've looked at quite carefully, and they are consistent with those that your students will use at GCSE and A level. And ultimately, the definitions are based on those of Ofqual. And the depth of treatment required in an answer is indicated by the command word. So, for example, describe questions require candidates to write about observed patterns in the results. And the answers, therefore, are usually always given in the question. You're describing what is presented in the stimulus material. Explain questions requires something else. It requires candidates to give scientific reasons for the patterns in the data that have been observed. State questions simply require a brief statement of fact. Now, all of the command words in the specification, there are many more we've put in, are the words that we will use in the exams. And again, we are checking to make sure that we are not using command words that are not in that list. And you can help your students to gauge the question by teaching them how to use the command words. This is a useful transferable skill because it is exactly the kind of thing that schools that I observe are teaching students to do in Key Stage 3 in preparation for GCSE and A level. The next slide, please. So what about this 11+ content? The specification at 13+ builds on ideas which were taught in 11+. And the specification contains cross-links to the relevant points of the 11+ syllabus, so that teachers can remind pupils or get pupils to research for themselves what they have learned in previous years. We can examine 11+ content at 13+, but only within a context that provides the necessary stimulus retrieval cues. We are not intending that you teach the 11+ syllabus before you start teaching the 13+ syllabus. Rather, that you use the 11+ ideas as a foundation starter for the beginning of each new topic. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. To reiterate earlier what I said, we want you to develop practical activities that allow the full range of thinking, working as a scientist skills to be developed. And those are in the specification. And we will assess these skills in the written papers. And we are looking to find ways of doing that, and we'll continue to do that over the next few years. We will assume that the student or the candidate has had no prior experience of that practical. And therefore, each question will contain all the necessary supporting information needed to be able to answer the question. And this is because of the wide variation in prep schools, and we cannot be certain that other than the recommended practicals, what a school will or won't be doing. Now, we have to find a way of doing this that allows the stimulus material to come in without necessarily increasing, or certainly without increasing, the amount of reading in a question. And therefore, we're going to be using diagrams and flowcharts as a way of simplifying and presenting information. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. We're going to think a little bit for the next few minutes about thinking and working as a scientist. And you can see that it's divided into a number of different sections. And what we would love you to do is to audit your course to see where students get opportunities to develop each of the skills within thinking and working as a scientist. This is time consuming. You won't necessarily be able to do it all in 1 year, but having done it, it will be an invaluable foundation for the future development of your course. As you know, GCSE and A-level courses require pupils to have a very high level of practical competence. The schools that I'm visiting at the moment with my PGCE students are busy preparing students for the internal examinations for their predicted grades. And one of the key things that keeps coming up in these schools are the assessed practicals. And therefore giving your students the skills base before they go to senior school will be a huge advantage. Next slide, please. So what should you do to prepare for these changes? I have been a head of science. I have been a curriculum developer. I have developed curricula within my schools. I've been through innumerable changes in GCSE over the years. And the important thing is you can't do everything at once, and you can't do it all in the first year. And it may take you 3 or 4 years to get to the point where you've actually developed this kind of science curriculum that you really aspire to do. That's fine. Take your time. Get it right. Next slide, please. So plan the course as a whole unit across the 3 sciences, looking to see where you'll teach the core content, which practice you'll do, where you'll develop TWAS. Decide which parts of the specification should be expanded to accommodate the practicals. But take this as an opportunity to liaise with other departments, such as mathematics, so that the graph plotting and the mathematical requirements of the TWAS can be taught to the students in a coordinated way at the same time, or so that they are not discovering something in science only then to relearn it in mathematics. The research suggests that children do not transfer ideas very readily from mathematics into science. And by coordinating this, then I think that's something that you can actually try to overcome. This could affect the sequencing of the way in which you teach the course. It would be wonderful if you could consider having a joint geography and biology field trip. You might like to consider liaising with the English department on how you teach literacy. Can we have the next slide, please? +13 assessment. We don't envisage any significant changes to the assessment at 13+. We probably will be using multiple choice items rather more frequently within questions other than question 1. And also probably a greater number of closed questions, such as fill the gap or matching pairs. And this is partly an attempt to reduce the amount of free writing required to free up some time in the examination space so that students can read the questions and think in more detail about the questions. We're looking very carefully, as I say, at how we're assessing knowledge and making sure that only no statements are assessed. I don't know whether you can see that. Mine's come back on. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. You know what it's like when you move house. You suddenly discover that the plugs are all in the wrong place and you've forgotten to do something you thought you got. We've made a very small number of tiny changes to the specification since we published the first one. And they're listed on the screen. We are not intending to change this specification again before the first round of examinations. So therefore, when you do your planning, make sure you download the latest version of the specification from the ISEB website. Now, in years to come, it may well be that we do want to tweak the syllabus a little bit. If we do decide to do that for future examination sessions, not this course, but future iterations of it, then we'll always publish them well in advance, both online in the specification, but also in ISEB communications too. But on the whole, we are feeling fairly happy with the specification that we've produced. So we're hoping that any changes will be kept to an absolute minimum. Okay, next slide, please. So let's just finish off then by thinking about some of the wider skills that Darrell was talking about. The critical thinking and independence. Every 13 plus paper contains at least one question which assesses critical thinking. Usually these come from thinking and working as a scientist, especially in the modeling scientific attitudes section. Next slide, please. These are evaluating and creating questions that we use for AO3. And again, you can read more about those in the spec. Next slide, please. Thank you. We hope that within the specification, pupils will be given the opportunity to do some form of research on their own, either practically or on the internet. One of the things that we feel very strongly about is that students need to be taught how to do constructive queries in Google. Google is difficult to use properly unless you're trained to do it. And we hope that you'll give students some opportunities to do some structured queries using a search engine so that they can learn how to do it effectively. As you've already heard, the ISEB extended project does provide accreditation for extended project work, and this can be something that becomes part of your objectives for your science teaching. Because as part of a portfolio of evidence, they can be used very successfully when moving to a senior school. Next slide, please. So we want this to be an enjoyable experience, exploring and learning science. We want you to explore links with other subjects. And we hope that interdisciplinary things might emerge. You might, for example, want to collaborate with the RE department and have a little session on what is life? What do scientists think life is? What do other systems of thought, including religions, think life is? We hope that new collaborations will emerge from this kind of thing. And if I can just finish by talking about an experiment of my own. This is a private project that I've been creating over the last year or so called Stories from Nowhere. There is very few materials produced which are deliberately trying to develop literacy at in years top end of Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 in science. Hardly anything. And Stories for Nowhere is started as a blog which contains short self-contained stories about biology, about a wood called Nowhere Wood, as it happens, which is just outside my window here. And these are designed to help students to think about the big ideas of science, but at the same time to promote their literacy. That might be something that appeals to you. Have a look at the site, and if you like it, then get in touch with me because I'd love to talk to you about it. And I try and publish, if I can, maybe one story every 2 weeks or so. There's a lot of stories on there now, mostly which are about ecology, so you might be interested in going to have a look at that. But this is one example of the kind of ideas that may well emerge as a result of the new synthesis on the course. So that's our course. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Neil. That was incredible. And in fact, I learned an awful lot about the science curriculum, but mostly about the hard work I know has gone in over the last couple of years in creating a really forward-thinking curriculum that brings in the best of what it is that the sector would like. So before I go any further, to support the science curriculum and actually the curriculum in general, our publisher Galore Park has created a whole range of books. You can see them here on screen. Now, if you'd like to know more about these, then Candice Thurston, her email is there, but we will also be sending out these slides to participants. It will be within the next week, so it won't be immediately after this session, but we will make sure everybody here gets them. You can also find out more on the Galore Park website, but these will be released this spring and summer, and I know that they've been through an entire endorsement process by all of our setters here at ISEB, so do check those out. The other thing to be aware of is that this recording will be up on YouTube after the event if you'd like to pass that on to colleagues, and it will be sat there for you to look at and reference. As I say, we will be sending the slides around to everybody, and also we've got a little bit of a questionnaire that we're working on with our publisher to explore what kinds of resources you need in your subjects and schools, so have a look out for that. We will also put an edited version of the video up onto the ISEB website, and you will be able to see that. It'll be really easy to find for you all. So there are many different ways to access this and make sure you've got all of the information you need. Or you can contact us directly. So we're at inquiries@iseb.co.uk, and we are there to answer all of your questions. We're pretty quick, so do get in contact if there are things that you need, any further questions that perhaps you might not have had time for. So what we're going to do now is a bit of a Q&A. Neil is ready to answer your questions. Now, for those of you that you do have to be logged into Google or YouTube to access our chat, but I will see those straight away on my screen. I've got about 5 or 6 questions that had come in prior to the event through Eventbrite. So I'm going to ask you those first, Neil.
Okay.
But then I can see Kelly and Ian. Thank you very much. I've got some questions. And like I say, if you minimize your screen and you are logged into YouTube, you will be able to access the chat at the bottom right-hand side of your screen and ask us any questions. So the first one that I had through, which I think is quite a good one, clearly, you know, teachers thinking about their preparation for the new year. How much do we need to change our schemes of work to accommodate the new specification?
I've been thinking about that question. I think it depends upon your scheme of work. I think to some extent, the challenge is going to be trying to teach all of the thinking and working as a scientist skills. And it may well be that you do a lot of that already, in which case you don't need to add very much to it. But it may well be that there are areas that you feel you do need to develop, and clearly that will need some modifications. We hope that by thinning out the content of the course, we're creating enough time to allow you to do that without straining it. The feeling about the existing common entrance 13+ syllabus, which is based on the Key Stage 3 program study, is that it's too dense. And so therefore, by creating this different approach, we're hoping that we are going to allow you to create some space to put things in. Far away. Yes. Julia.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I thought you said fire away. Sorry, I thought you said by the way, and you said fire
away. No, keep them coming, Julia.
Well, right, so with topics slimmed down, could you explain the rationale?
Well, the rationale is as I've just said, really. I think we wanted to create space for schools to create their own science curriculum, which allowed their students to develop the science and the broader skills in the way that they felt was appropriate for their students, and that's what we're trying to produce. I should be fascinated, I think, to find out how it implements from here.
Thank you, Neil. How do we ensure practicals are sufficient to prepare for the exam? So I think I was listening intently actually to your presentation, and certainly for me, I was thinking, gosh, it's brilliant that children are doing the practicals. How then should teachers prepare them to make sure that they can reflect and remember how that might be represented in the exam?
That's a very good question, isn't it? I think students are going to have to be able to analyze different kinds of data, plot different kinds of graphs, interpret different kinds of information, rather like they do at the moment. And therefore, we're not envisaging any great changes to the way in which we assess this. So I think, but clearly they do need to be able to understand what an experiment is, how you control variables, what an independent variable is, what a dependent variable is, and they need to be able to calculate means and so on. So though that is where you start from, the TWAS, and then you make sure that the practicals that you do allow them to develop those skills. But what we're not going to be do is asking students details about methods. That's not really where we're at. It's more to do with presenting the information that an experiment might give you.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. This question I really like, actually, because it's something that we're really interested in studying ourselves here at ISEB. But it's how well do you think Science CE prepares students for GCSE?
Very well, I would have thought. I mean, I genuinely do. So I'm not just saying that because I'm sitting here. I genuinely do think it does. The emphasis on the core practicals is at GCSE is important because they really are examined in detail at GCSE, including the methods. And therefore, you know, giving them, allowing your students to go into senior school, being able to plot a graph, being able to analyze data, being able to spot patterns is something that's going to make their life easier, and it's going to mean that they're more confident when they start tackling these kind of questions at GCSE. And the extraordinary thing is just how sophisticated the science understanding students have to have, even to get the lower grades at GCSE. GCSE is a really difficult exam, and therefore the more we can do that to prepare them, the better, really.
Thank you very much, Neil. I've got one more from the preparation session that people sent in, and then I shall be going to, in this order, Kelly, who actually has a couple of questions, so I'll do those both at the same time, then Ian, David, and an anonymous YouTube viewer. But firstly, before I do that, the last question from the preparation was, what are the differences between foundation and level 2, and which should we choose?
Which are the differences between what?
Foundation and level 2.
We've always said that we wanted the foundation papers to have proper science in them, but to be much simpler in terms of the way that the information is presented and the answers that the students have to give. The foundation paper is one single science paper, whereas the L2 papers are 3 separate papers. But what we did not want to do was kind of water down the science. We wanted the foundation paper to be a valid science exam in its own right. So it's more to do with the way the exam is structured rather than as much as anything else. But there are certainly things that for example, we would, if we were going to put an equation on the foundation tier paper, we would give the equation always, and we wouldn't get students to expect to know any equations. So yeah, so that's something that we would avoid.
Thank you, Neil. Well, I'm going to go to the questions directly from tonight. So I'm going to start with Kelly's question. Now, you are going to have to forgive me here because I am not a scientist. But energy, am I right that we are referring to stores? How will a swing GPE to KE work in that circumstance, for example? Thanks.
So can I find that question on the screen?
The question should be on the screen down there for you as well, Neil. I'm afraid this one's beyond.
I'm only getting 5. I did the question about stores was there, but it seems to have disappeared. Let's see if I can bring it back up. I can't. Okay. Can you read the question about energy stores again for me, please?
Absolutely. It says, energy, am I right that we are referring to stores? How will a swing GPE arrow to KE work in, which means kinetic energy, work in that circumstance, for example?
Yeah, and there's also a question further down about reproducibility, reliability, and so on. What we are intending to do, and we're going to do it fairly soon, is to produce a kind of very short briefing paper on energy and also on those terminology. The reproducibility, reproducibility bit comes from the ASE documentation. But what we'll do is we'll summarize the key bits of that and get that out to schools within certainly by the end of term, so that you do have a key steer on that. The energy stores thing is now standard at Key Stage 3. And we didn't put it in before, but we felt we ought to start bringing it in now. I'm not a physicist, so the detailed answer to your question is one that I'll leave for the physicists. But I'll pass your, if you can leave your email with Julia, I'll get our physics guy to answer your question in detail, because if I try to do it, I get it wrong. So I'll get him to do it. But what we will do is certainly those little bits of the syllabus which are new, like those terminology and energy stores, we are intending to produce short briefing papers just to give the key ideas.
Thank you. And actually, Kelly, you and I had some conversations beforehand, so we've got each other's email addresses, but if you just want to prompt me at the end, I shall make sure that you get an answer to that question as well. But thank you very much, Neil. Some tricky physics questions coming in. I've got one from Ian Tinkler. Can you comment on the use of reliability versus repeatability and reproducibility, please?
Well, I've just said, yes, I can. I can't do it off the top of my head without sort of waffling, but I'll make sure that there's a summary briefing paper that goes out to you explaining what we mean by those key terms, and we will probably add it to the syllabus as well, because what we're getting from you is valuable feedback on what you need to be able to do this, and so therefore those kind of comments are very helpful, and we'll make sure that you get answers to those questions very soon. So if you can make sure they all end up with Julia, then she'll feed them down to us, and we'll produce a response paper to you, because you're absolutely right. We need to be all on the same playing field. In fact, the reliability one is exactly as it is written in the ASE documentation. So if you can get hold of the ASE paper, that you'll find the answer to that question there. I got one that says from Ian Tinkler about, will the level 1 papers continue to simplify language? We're not envisaging any changes to the way that the level 1 papers are produced. They're produced by the same team with the same design specs, and they have their own. I have to say, I'm very proud of the L1 papers. I think they are superb exams written by a very caring team, and they will continue to do what they've always done. You'd be surprised how little feedback we get on the exams. We are very lucky to get any feedback at all from more than maybe 2 centres. And this is partly because ISEB sends out a questionnaire right at the end of the summer term, and maybe it doesn't get passed on. But we would very much like to get your feedback on these papers. So therefore, when that survey comes around, you make sure it's sent to you, and you make sure you fill it in, because I can assure you we take your comments extremely seriously, and we do implement the kind of things that you suggest. But if we don't get the feedback back, then we don't know.
Thank you very much,
now,
Neil.
yeah. Any other suggestions? Yeah, okay. It is intended to be a very general statement, and that is because what we don't want to do is to close down right answers by having a very prescriptive mark scheme. So a suggested answer is something that's correct but isn't on the mark scheme. We're not suggesting you give credit for incorrect answers, but we don't want any candidate to be disadvantaged if there's another way of putting it that isn't quite in the mark scheme. I do get criticised particularly by GCSE examiners who say our mark schemes don't stand up to scrutiny. But if you think about their purpose is to allow either you or a senior school to assess a candidate's potential only against the other candidates that they're marking. So as long as the marker uses the mark scheme consistently, that's all that matters. And that's why we've continued to use those rather vague phrases. Oh, lots of questions coming. Do I consider?
Neil, if it's okay, I've got everyone coming in sequentially, and I can get those onto the screen.
All right. Well, you tell them sequentially, so we do the oldest ones first.
Yes, I've got David, who said, you referred to trimming the content, but I see the new syllabus says that 13 plus assessments will examine 11 plus content. whereas the former syllabus would only examine 11 plus in the context of the 13 plus syllabus.
No, no. What I said in the presentation is that we are only going to examine 11 plus syllabus in the context of the 13 plus examination. So we haven't actually changed that policy. I may not have made it as explicit as I should have done in the new syllabus, but we haven't changed the policy on that. You won't get questions from the 11 plus syllabus which are not related to 13 plus topics. That's not the intention. But the intention is that they bring their 11 plus knowledge into the 13 plus classroom so they can start working on it to help them develop the new knowledge on top. It's a kind of constructivist model. You're building on what's already there. And that very much is Ofsted likes that. So that's part of the Ofsted review as well.
Oh, brilliant. We've got to thank you for David there. The next one isn't TWAS just a new acronym for the old scientific inquiry?
Yes.
Brilliant.
Absolutely. I was waiting for someone to spot that. It is exactly what it is.
Excellent. Well, it's always good to know.
Consider it a rebranding.
Well, people will see evidence of that all over the screen tonight. Actually, we have another one from Ian. Will the level 1 papers continue to simplify language, e.g. sugar instead of glucose, alcohol instead of ethanol? This currently causes confusion when teaching to mixed ability groups. Yeah, that's a very important point. We are considering carrying on the L1 papers much as they are. However, the point that you're making about having mixed L1 and L2 classes is something that we need to think about. And I thank you for raising that question. It's clearly very important. It may well be that the way to do this is to put sugar brackets glucose in the L1 question, but maybe only put glucose in the L2. I don't know. That's just off the top of my head. But we'll take that question back and I'll share it with the L1 setters. And again, we'll think about what you're saying. But that is exactly the kind of feedback that we value. Thank you very much. So I think this is a lovely piece of feedback here from Karen, who says, thank you. Actually, I saw it coming 18 months ago. I've already rewritten schemes of work to account for skills-based learning. Thank you. Science is now about being a scientist. That's lovely. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karen. That's most appreciated. Karen, you could make some good money by selling your scheme of work, I think, at this moment in time.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We have a YouTube viewer. Could you give guidance on the exam papers when any other suggestions are included in the mark scheme? That is a very general statement.
Well, I think we've already addressed that one. As I said, it's any suggestion that is correct, that is expressed in a different way to what's in the mark scheme.
Okay. No, thank you very much.
We try to avoid having very lengthy mark schemes. In fact, they're not really mark schemes in an examination sense. They're I can't even remember what we say on the paper now. Suggestions or something, isn't it? Suggestions for marking or something. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We've only got a few more, only a couple more. From Joe. Did you consider separate papers for the 3 sciences at foundation level 1 rather than a longer single paper? Many of our pupils that sit level 1 have extra time, which can make it very long.
We did not consider having 3 papers. Well, we did consider having 3 papers and we decided to have a single paper. So there will be 1 examination session. If you feel, and we do understand about the extra time, and if you feel very strongly that the foundation paper is unwieldy because of its length, that is some feedback we would value. We have at this time chosen not to change the assessment model, because we felt changing the specification and the assessment model at the same time is just too much to cope with. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't review the foundation paper in the light of your valuable feedback and consider changes to it. They would be obviously be phased in good time. But it's been a while since we've revised and thought about the foundation paper, and therefore we would certainly welcome an opportunity to look at that. But we need to get a consensus from the L1 users of how they want it to be used. And if we don't get that consensus, then we can't really move forward with that. So again, if you feel that you're making an extremely important point, make sure that we get that sent to us so we can look at it.
Questions in here. Apologies to Kelly, I did skip over one, and I did reference that she'd asked another one. She just wanted to be clear, you don't envisage a question asking for a pupil to write a brief method for one of the recommended practicals.
Right, yeah, just to clarify, if it's a recommended practical, we might ask them to write a method, but only for the recommended practicals, not for anything else. That was my point. My point was, if this is a practical that we choose to bring in that isn't a recommended practical, we wouldn't ask them detailed questions about the method. But for the recommended practicals, we might. So, for example, I can imagine I wrote some years ago, a long time ago, I wrote a question where we had all the basic bits of apparatus that you need to make a microscope slide, and we asked you to put the candidates to put them in order. I mean, that's exactly, we could do that for the recommended practicals, but not for anything else.
Okay, thank you. Well, at the moment, we've only got one question left, so this is a last call for any other questions. But our YouTube viewer, how will TWAS be differentiated for level 1 papers? That's a good question.
In the same way that working scientifically is differentiated now. If you look at, I mean, again, it's difficult for me to answer this in the abstract without having papers in front of you. But if you look at the way that graphs are plotted, for example, on L1, and you compare it with L2, there's much more structure given in L1 than there is in L2, and that will continue. So again, the kinds of questions that are being asked at the moment in L1 for working scientifically will be the kinds of questions that are going to be asked in TWAS. So as somebody perceptively pointed out, we haven't, although it looks like we've changed it a lot, there are relatively few places where we have changed it. And in those places, sample reliability and so on, we'll make sure that you do get a briefing paper about what the changes are. Excellent.
Thank you. Well, I'm just looking at our screen, and I think that ends the questions for this evening. So just a huge thank you, Neil. That was very, very informative. And as ever, you've delivered a huge amount of information. Neil's absolutely right. We can field other questions later on. I'm just having a quick look. Karen has asked another brief question. Karen, what I will do is I will email you directly after this. I will make sure I find your email address. And of course, we can get you guys chatting about the science specification. Just to finish off, the YouTube video will actually come back onto this channel. So if you would like to look again or pass it on to colleagues, then you can just go to the YouTube channel, click on videos, and all of the videos from the whole session so far will be up there for you. We will also be putting these up with the PDF of the slides, and there's a little questionnaire for anything that you wanted to feedback to us about, particularly around resources. And so, you know, a huge thank you to all of you, particularly to Neil, for a great session. And, you know, loads of thanks for you coming up on the chat, Neil. So I think
thank you.
Had a good time.
You have to understand, for me, it's a very peculiar experience because all I'm doing is staring at a clock, but I'm glad you enjoyed it.
No, thank you. We did enormously. And so just all that remains me to say is we look forward to seeing you again in any of our other sessions. And as I say, if you want to contact us directly on inquiries@iseb.co.uk, we'll make sure if we've missed anything at all, we get straight back to you. So thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon.